The elites don't want you to know this, but you can just take milk straight from the cow and turn it into things like yogurt, butter, cheese. The options are endless, and you don't need a bunch of fancy supplies from cheese making companies. All you need is your raw milk and a little bit of salt. Today, we're going to talk about it. We're going to dive into the conspiracies around raw milk and the basics of natural cheese making. It's been a while since we have gone down a rabbit hole and talked about conspiracies, so let's do it. I have a question. Why did Lord Nathaniel Rothschild give a speech to the House of Lords in 1946 about compulsory pasteurization of milk? This was actually his maiden speech in the House of Lords. So why was this such an important topic? Was it because raw milk is deadly and it's been killing people left and right for all of history? Well, no, that's not true. We went over that in last week's video when we talked about the swill milk scandal that was happening in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, when people were moving into cities, leaving the farm and the family cows behind, and they were drinking milk that was coming from cows being fed nasty byproducts from alcohol distilleries. These cows were so sickly that the milk was actually bluish green and had pus and sediment in it. But the distillers used like flour and plaster to restore the white creamy color to the milk, and then peddled it to the masses, which then gave this milk to their babies. And that's what was causing people to die from milk consumption, especially babies. So when we hear that babies were dying from drinking raw milk, that is not the case. It wasn't the fact that the milk was not pasteurized that was killing the babies. It was the really poor conditions. These cows were basically being poisoned. Anyway, that's just a quick recap, but if you want the full story, go back and watch last week's video. But why would one of the most powerful men in the world give his first speech in the House of Lords on pasteurizing milk? A food that has been consumed by people for all of civilized history, and it's been considered, the land of milk and honey. It's been considered one of the most nutrient-rich foods. Well, my answer is that it's just another stepping stone along the path of the depopulation agenda. One great way to depopulate the earth, or even just to really weaken people and kind of get them under your thumb, under your control, so they're more vulnerable and easy to deceive, is just to take away their agency, make them more dependent on not only the government, but on the factory for their food. For all of history, people got their food from their farm, from their backyard, from their neighbor, from their village. But when we take that away, local sourcing of food, and we make people dependent on this elaborate system of factory food where your food is coming from halfway across the world, and it has to undergo all of these scientific processes to make it safe for consumption, that makes people incredibly vulnerable and really easy to control. I recently read that I think the average American town, if you would just go through and, take an inventory of all the food that people had in their home, like in their pantry or stored up, the average American town has enough food, and this is including in grocery stores in those towns, for 2 to 3 days. So, in the event of any kind of emergency, after 2 to 3 days, people would start running out of food. And when people run out of food, that's when things get really bad. Modern is out and grandma core is back in. We are bringing it back. And I can tell you one thing that grandma did not have in her cozy home was synthetic fibers, because if you go back far enough, she didn't have access to synthetic fibers. She just had what was natural, what was available to her. Maybe, cotton, linen, wool, whatever she had. And it was so much more cozy, but also so much healthier. There are so many risks to being exposed to synthetic materials all the time. However, I have a really easy hack for you guys. Just start by thinking about your sleep environment. We spend over a third of our life sleeping. So if we can just switch our sleep environment over to using natural fibers, that makes a huge difference. And the perfect way to get started with that, which is really easy, is switching over to a Birch Living mattress. We have had our Birch Living mattress for about 9 months now, and we are loving it. I love that Birch Living uses natural materials in their mattresses like organic cotton and organic wool, as opposed to things like polyurethane foams, which result in off-gassing, so you're breathing in these dangerous chemicals all night. And most mattresses use fiberglass as a flame retardant because it's really cheap and easy to use, but that is also toxic. So these are just toxic things that, 8 hours a day we are laying right on those mattresses and breathing those things in. But with Birch Living, you don't have to sacrifice comfort and safety for health. The mattresses are so comfortable, and wool actually acts as a natural flame retardant. It also has antimicrobial properties, and it's great for temperature regulation. If you've ever read anything about cloth diapering, you'll know this. This is why cloth diapering moms love wool, because it's not too hot or too cold on baby. It keeps them at just the right temperature. It's super absorbent, and it's so great for baby's skin. So those same principles apply when you use wool in your mattress. Right now is the last chance to get in on New Year's savings on a Birch Living mattress. You can get 20% off your Birch mattress plus 2 free pillows when you use my link, birchliving.com/Hopewell Heights. And it's so simple. Your mattress will be shipped straight to your door, and it's like vacuum packed, really small. So it's not this massive package. You just bring it in and open it up. Birch Living also offers a 100-night sleep trial. So if for some reason you try your new mattress and you're not happy with it, then you can send it back for a full refund. They also have a 25-year warranty. So this is a long-term investment for your health and comfort. I know you guys are going to love Birch Living. Check them out. I'll put my link and more details in the description below the video. So we've been tricked into fearing raw milk and believing that milk itself is harmful and that we shouldn't trust our local farmers and that they're dirty. The milk they're drinking is dirty, that they're taking a risk, taking a gamble with their life, with their children's life. And it's much safer if we just trust the experts with our food, and we just trust the milk at the grocery store, that by the time we buy it, it's probably a month old, and it's been through so many processes like homogenization and pasteurization, which heats it up to a point where, yes, any harmful bacteria are killed, but also all beneficial bacteria and digestive enzymes. So essentially what we have is a month-old dead product. This is a dead food that the body just can't register and can't break down. What they don't want you to know is that raw milk is not only safe when it comes from healthy cows that are taken care of properly, but it's also foundational for good nutrition. And there are things that you can do with raw milk that you just can't do with pasteurized milk, and that's what I'm going to show you today. So here I have some fresh, well, it's not quite fresh, it's a couple days old, but this is just milk that was milked out of my cow and put straight into my fridge. So this is what you would expect to see if you wanted a glass of milk. You can kind of see a little bit of a cream line, but if I shook it up really good, then all of the fat globules here would mix in with the milk and it would be nice and creamy. And then what I have behind me here, all of this is also raw milk, and this is what I want to talk to you about today, because you just can't do this with pasteurized milk. Here I have a clabber starter, curdled milk, and milk kefir. All of these things were made just by letting fresh raw milk sit out at room temperature. That's all I did. So let me walk you through how I did this and what I use these things for. So actually, let's start first with the curdled milk. So as you can see here, this milk has totally separated into curd and whey. Now, curd is what you use to make cheese. So if you leave store-bought pasteurized milk out on the counter, it is not going to separate like this. It's going to start smelling really terrible, and actually you will start to get curd and sediment that settles to the bottom of the milk, and then the whey will look really cloudy and it will be at the top. Whereas this milk that has been out on my counter for a week, I did nothing. I milked my cow, I strained a gallon of milk into this jar, loosely covered it with a lid, and set it on my counter. And after a couple of days, it started to thicken. A couple more days, it started to separate. And now in a week, it is fully separated into this massive curd, and it just smells like cheese. So this is probably how the first cheeses were made. People didn't have refrigerators, but they had lots of milk coming in every day. So they would just let it set out and use it as they could. And they noticed over a couple days it started to sour, and that was like your, more primitive yogurt. And that is what this milk looked like after a couple of days of sitting on my counter. It just looked kind of like a runny yogurt, but if you let it sit out just a little while longer, you can see bubbles in here, still lots of activity going on, then the curd totally separates. And people have always known that you can preserve food with salt. So I can just imagine people, taking this separated curd and maybe pressing it, noticing that if I were to remove this right now, and I think we'll do that, I'll just show you guys. If I were to take this separated curd out of this jar, there would still be lots of liquid whey that was kind of seeping out of it. So maybe they would press that whey out and try to get as much liquid out as possible, and then preserve it by rubbing salt all over the outside. And that is cheese making, my friend. It is just getting the curd and milk to separate from the whey, pressing out all the whey, removing, it is just getting the curd and milk to separate from the whey, and then either eating it fresh or pressing it and salting it for preservation, and then maybe aging it. That's cheese making. So once again, you cannot do this. You cannot make primitive cheese that's actually edible with store-bought, pasteurized, ultra-processed milk. All right, the next thing I'm gonna show you is my clabber starter. This is a huge clabber starter. Now you hear the word starter and maybe you're thinking of sourdough starter, and yes, it's kind of in the same vein. A clabber starter is basically a starter for cheese making, like a starter culture for cheese making. You guys know sourdough starter. I have my starter right here. She needs to be fed, but a sourdough starter is just fermented wheat that you use to culture your flour and water when you're mixing together your dough, and it ferments, breaks down into lactic acid bacteria, and causes the dough to rise, and then you bake your bread. I have lots of videos and blog posts with all the details on making and maintaining a sourdough starter and using it to make all sorts of breads, from artisan breads to sandwich loaves and all kinds of baked goods, cookies, muffins. I mean, anything you bake, you can make a sourdough version of that. I think everybody's pretty familiar with that now, but I'm telling you, a clabber starter is the new sourdough starter. This is gonna be the new thing, keeping your own cheese making starter culture on your counter, just like you do with sourdough. So what is a clabber starter? Well, it's just raw milk that has been left out at room temperature, but unlike the curdled milk here, after a few days, when it starts to get to that like yogurt-like thick consistently, but before it separates into this curd and whey, you're going to discard like 95% of it, just like a sourdough starter. Discard most of it, leave just a little bit, and then feed it with more raw milk. And then wait another day or two until it thickens up and do the same thing. It's that feed, discard rhythm, just like we do with a sourdough starter, except with raw milk. And I can tell you that I've just been experimenting with this because this is all kind of new to me. I did a little bit with clabber the last time I had a calf, but it's been a while. So I have actually not fed this clabber starter in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And it hasn't separated into curd and whey like this jar here. And that is because this was an established clabber starter that I had fed and discarded several times, and now it's just got a nice collection of beneficial bacteria in here that is keeping it at this consistency and acidity and ready to use when I want to use it in baking or cheese making. And so clabber is something that you can use it in many different ways. You can actually strain clabber and make it into like a yogurt or cheese. So if you wanted to do that, you would just strain it through a cheesecloth. And if you want to make it more like a yogurt, then only strain it for an hour or two. If you want to make it into more of like almost like a firm ricotta cheese texture, then you can strain it for like 12 hours or 24 hours. I've done both and I actually really like it. I've actually stopped making yogurt because the process of yogurt making involves keeping milk incubated at a higher temperature for a longer amount of time. They're just more involved. Whereas with clabber, I just let it sit out at room temperature with a little bit of my clabber starter. So, you know, a gallon of fresh milk, right? I would take a gallon of fresh milk, put a little bit of my clabber starter in there, let it sit out for 24 hours, and then I have a full gallon of fermented clabber that I can strain into a yogurt-like product. Not the exact same consistency, you just have to try it. But like I said, you can strain that into cheese, salt it, add herbs, add honey, add whatever you want. It's so versatile. The other thing that you can do with this is you can bake with it. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the baking powder brand called Clabber Girl. Well, baking powder, Clabber Girl, where it gets its name is from clabber, because originally, before baking powder was available, clabber was used as a leavening agent in combination with baking soda in a lot of recipes. And so what I've been doing is I just substitute clabber for the liquid portion of whatever I'm baking, and then add some baking soda as well. So this works especially well in things like pancakes. I will link my sourdough pancake recipe in the description for you guys. I've been making this so much with my clabber. And all I do is just 1 for 1. I sub clabber for milk, and then I leave out the baking powder, and they're absolutely delicious. So if you wanted to keep a clabber starter and start experimenting with substituting clabber for baking powder, the ratio would be for every teaspoon of baking powder, you would need 1 cup of clabber plus I think a half teaspoon of baking soda. You just need to think about the liquid components of your recipe to make that work. Last but definitely not least, as far as the uses for a clabber starter, it's for cheese making. So I don't know, should we call this a clabber starter or a cheese starter? So we've got sourdough starters, maybe cheese making starter, cheese starter. Cheese starter has a nice ring to it, but I like clabber. I like clabber. But anyway, you can actually use your clabber to inoculate your milk for cheese making, meaning that you do not need to buy cheese making starter cultures from cheese making supply companies ever again if you have access to quality raw milk, because all of the isolated strains that you need to make all different kinds of cheeses, whether it's mesophilic or thermophilic, it can get really confusing, right? All of that is already in raw milk. It's native to raw milk. So when you just let quality raw milk ferment into clabber and you keep a clabber starter, you have everything in here to make any kind of cheese you want. And that is so much more sustainable than having to order a million supplies from cheese making companies halfway across the world. That, by the way, these cheese making companies are owned by larger companies that definitely do not have our best interest at heart, and a lot of their products are GMO. So when you use their GMO cheese starter cultures in your raw milk, now you have a GMO product. So I would highly encourage you, if you do consume raw milk and you're interested in cheese making, definitely look into going the natural cheese making route with a clabber starter or milk kefir. And that is actually the last thing I have sitting here that I wanted to show you, and that is milk kefir. See, this is my raw milk that I added some kefir grains to, and now it's nice and thick. It's got that yogurty consistency. You guys are probably familiar with milk kefir, but maybe you didn't know, milk kefir just doesn't work quite as well with pasteurized milk, especially if it's ultra high temperature pasteurized milk. You can still make it work if it's a lower temperature pasteurization, but you're not going to get the same product as if you use a high quality raw milk. And kefir can actually also be used to inoculate milk for cheese making. So 2 options here for natural cheese making: keeping a clabber starter that can be used in many ways, or keeping milk kefir. I would say one difference between, you don't need to keep both. One difference between kefir and clabber is kefir tends to hold its uniform consistency more, so it's not going to separate if you press it. No, it will, but just not as quickly, not as much if you would, strain it in a cheesecloth or press it. Whereas clabber, once I would put this through a cheesecloth, it would actually separate pretty rapidly, which makes it nice for hanging it into a thicker yogurt or a cheese. All right, so that's our rabbit hole, conspiracy talk today. They don't want us to drink raw milk. They don't want us to have access to raw milk. It's actually illegal to sell raw milk in many states in this country because they want to take away our agency. They want to feed us inferior food products, and they don't want us to know that we can have an abundant source of protein and nutrition in our diets, that we can make things like cheese and yogurt without all of these fancy extra starter cultures or products from cheese making companies halfway around the world. All you need is either a cow or a friend with a cow. Like, that is all you need, my friend, to make these things. So, if you don't currently have access to raw milk, then check out this website that I just showed you. I'll link it in the description. Everything I talked about, all the resources, the book that I recommend on learning about natural cheese making and keeping of raw milk. I'm going to link all of that in the description below the video, so just tap the more button. I will be doing more on natural cheese making as time goes on, but I'm not an expert. I'm just learning about a lot of this and passing on the information with my own little twist on it, adding in the conspiracies, because that's what I do. That's what I like to do. You guys like that too. And so that's why we do it. So that's it for this week. Be sure to subscribe if you want to follow along with this natural cheese making journey as I learn and I share with you guys. Before you go, also remember to check out the offer that Birch Living has for Hopewell Heights subscribers in the description. I'll see you guys next week.